What is a Zelda game? I know that sounds like a silly question, but really, what is a Zelda game? Is it a linear game with a heavy focus on narrative and cinematic set pieces? Does that make Uncharted 3 a Zelda game? No, of course not. A Zelda game is a game with a focus on adventure, dungeons, towns, and side quests. So then is Skyrim a Zelda game? No, a real Zelda game is about exploration, discovery. It's a truly open world whose pace, direction, and flow is dictated entirely by you. That's not a Zelda game. Whatever, let's figure this out. Let's uncover the secret of the Zelda formula. Let's find out just what makes a Zelda game. There's always been discussion about what makes one Zelda game better than another, but an argument I see brought up a lot is it's just not true to the Zelda formula. I've seen this for Skyward Sword's linearity, and adversely I've seen it for Breath of the Wild's openness. Today, we'll figure out just what that secret formula actually is, or better yet, if it even exists at all. I'll be focusing on 3 Zelda games: Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Breath of the Wild. We'll start with Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is a divisive game, to say the least. Let me get this out of the way right now. I really like this game. Wait, please don't leave, I can explain. I think this game has the best presentation and story out of any Zelda game. As far as adventures go, Link isn't traveling across the world from town to town. It's a much more condensed adventure. This one is just the dungeons and the areas that house them. However, it's this incredible focus that makes this game special. The story of Skyward Sword is probably the best of any Zelda game. The story is all about Zelda and Link fulfilling their destiny as the goddess and her chosen hero respectively. This premise sounds pretty generic, sure. It's certainly not treading any new grounds as far as Zelda goes. However, the way it tells this story is what makes it so exceptional. Take the intro, for example. The reason why Skyward Sword's intro is so good is because it does exactly what an intro is supposed to do. It introduces you to the floating island of Skyloft and the colorful people who live there, from Groose and his cronies to Fledge to Link's childhood friend Zelda. Fledge is a goofy kid who's a bit of a good-for-nothing. You see him trying to lift some barrels and you have the option to help him. You can't help but befriend him because clearly no one else has. Then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum, Groose. Groose's favorite pastime is antagonizing Link. But despite that, he's overflowing with personality. His facial expressions, the way he speaks, his absolutely legendary hair, even his goons are built so weird. The length of this intro is important. By being as long as it is, it gets the player used to the calm, ideal life that the people of Skyloft live every day. Then, this happens. It's such a total 180 compared to everything that's happened up to this point. The scene after this is brilliant. You walk through the sleeping town, which itself is a stark contrast to the lively town of the day. You go from the bustling town with colorful characters and upbeat music to this quiet scene. You're the only one here. The calmness of this scene is incredible. But it's not just a stark contrast to the daytime. Link's childhood friend Zelda is gone. She's fallen down to an unknown land that no one's ever been to. No one even knows what's down there. Now you have this quiet scene by yourself to just reflect on everything that happened. When I played this intro, I got the same feeling I got when I played this game 10 years... Whoa, stop. This game did not come out 10 years ago. I refuse to believe it. I won't. Well, like I was saying, I got the same feeling I had when I played this game 10 years ago. It's an adventure. It's about courageously diving into the unknown. There's this great scene when you enter the first dungeon where you see a close-up of Link's face, and for a brief moment you see a hint of uncertainty, and maybe even fear, but that doesn't stop him. He goes forth regardless of his uncertainty, because true courage isn't about being fearless. It's doing something in spite of your fear. This story is so cinematic, it's like you're playing a movie. From the spectacular orchestrated music to the art style to the cutscenes and characters, it's all building upon this idea that Link is going on an epic quest to save his childhood friend. Now, if just the intro was this good, it wouldn't be enough. Fortunately for Skyward Sword, it doesn't stop at the intro. The twists in this game are wonderful. There's a scene where you jump down for a routine trip to the surface, but this time, it's more than a bit different. So Groose decides it's time for him to save Zelda himself. Here's what I love about this section of the game. Groose proudly tells Link he can go home now since he's gonna take it from here. He goes to the temple only to see an old lady tell him he's not built for this. Groose thinks this is absurd until the imprisoned shows up, at which point he realizes he is not in fact built for this. This is probably the first time reality ever hits Groose in his life, and it hits him pretty hard. It's honestly pretty tough not to feel at least a little bad for the guy when you see him drag himself out of the temple in such a sorry state. But through the rest of the story, he gets his confidence back, manages to help Link defeat the imprisoned, and even save Zelda. I love that Groose goes from some weirdo who's obsessed with bullying Link and simping over Zelda to this genuinely lovable goofball who helps save the world. One last scene I want to talk about. When you finally get the Master Sword and are able to go back in time and meet with Zelda, you get my favorite scene in any Zelda game. Zelda gives you a huge plot dump here and reveals that she doesn't have the powers of the goddess, she doesn't have the blood of the goddess, no, she is the goddess. Every other Zelda is a descendant of this Zelda, who is again the actual goddess reborn as a mortal. She chose to reincarnate as a mortal to be able to use the Triforce to finish off the villain of the story demise once and for all. But that wasn't her entire plan. The goddess actually set up this entire story. She sent Impa to the future to help Zelda in her quest, she made Fi to help her eventual chosen hero, she made the Goddess Sword which would later become the Master Sword, she gave the dragons parts of the songs needed to get the Triforce that she hid in Skyloft. The Triforce was right there the whole time. I love this reveal. The goddess, who is now Zelda, set this entire adventure up from the start. From the sword to the dragons to the flames and the songs, it's just incredible. But every good story has its colorful characters to go along with it, and Skyward Sword is no exception. They lack the depth of, say, Final Fantasy characters, but they more than make up for it with their charm and colorful personalities. There's a reason everyone remembers Groose 10 years after the game came out. But of course, it's not just Groose. Although he is the GOAT, most characters in this game have some quirk to them that makes them fun to interact with. Take the shop owner Beetle, for example. Beetle pedals on his bike to keep his flying shop in the air. When you get on, he'll make a comment about how it's much more difficult to pedal with you on board. This by itself is a silly interaction. But if you don't buy anything, this dude opens up a trap door and tosses you out of the shop with a villainous smile. Beetle's just a shop owner, but this is what I mean when I say every character in this game is overflowing with personality. Look at another shop owner. Rupin is this hyper-cheerful, almost creepy guy who desperately wants to sell you his wares. But at night, that cheerful facade fades away as you see him grumpy in his home willing to purchase monster parts for you. Weird guy. Anyway, Skyloft is filled with characters like this. That friendly demon who wants to be human, the crazy old guy at the Lumpy Pumpkin, Groose's goons, Colin and Stritch. The whole island is just filled with so much life. So although there's only one town in this game, it honestly might be the single best town in the series. So maybe that's Zelda. Is the Zelda formula an epic cinematic story with colorful characters? Well, maybe. But we're forgetting a few things. The format of Skyward Sword goes like this. Do something on the sky, specifically in Skyloft, go down to the surface, complete a dungeon, go back to the sky, repeat. It's simple enough, but remember, that's all it is. Keep this in mind, it'll be important later. This whole game focuses strictly on dungeons, puzzles, and story. This game is extremely linear. Now there's not much else to say regarding the gameplay. That might sound surprising, but I played the Switch version without motion controls, so honestly the combat was pretty simple. I don't have much else to say on it. Now it might seem like I think this game is perfect. No. The linearity and padding in this game cannot be understated. But my main issue is the game's insistence on keeping you on the exact path it wants you on. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. The Last of Us 1 is one of the greatest games ever made, and it's extremely linear. The issue is with the padding and the absolute inability to have any say in how the adventure goes. I'll give 3 examples. See this guy? This is the fun wheel guy. His name is Dodo. So Dodo lost his fun wheel. He dropped it beneath the clouds. I actually saw this before he even told me about it, but I couldn't pick it up yet. So I go, okay, cool. Make a mental note, come back when you get the ability to carry things from the ground to the sky. Fast forward to getting a robot friend who can do just that. I go back down to the wheel and am unable to pick it up. Turns out the game wants you to see the robot pick up a story-related item before he can pick up side quest items. You know what? Fine, fair. Story first, then I'll do the side quest. So, I finish the story quest, immediately go back to the desert to get the wheel and bring it back to the clown, but I still can't pick it up. You actually have to talk to the clown, hear that he lost his wheel, and then you can go pick it up. This bothered me a fair bit since it's not a one-time thing. Anytime you try to do things even slightly out of order, the game stops you. A slightly less egregious example of this is also in the Lanayru Desert. After you get your dual claw shots, you can travel to the Sand Sea. So I'm moving, flying from place to place, excited to see the next area, when suddenly a locked door obstructs my path. Alright, let's go find the key somewhere. But, let me talk to this Goron first. He gives you the key. No questions asked, no tasks to be done, just gives you the key. Why? What's the point of the locked door then? So I have to speak to this Goron about his archaeological dig? It's that important to the story that this Goron tells me about the fact that he's digging? It's just such a strange choice to me that the game feels it's absolutely necessary you speak to this Goron. And don't get me wrong, he's not a bad guy, he's fine. But again, ask yourself, would the story be worse if talking to this Goron was optional? Upon meeting the forest dragon Farron, you're told to get some special water from the end of the first dungeon, which alone would be a waste of time. But no, it doesn't stop there. A door in the dungeon is locked and you need a key to get through it. Where's the key? It's buried somewhere in the first part of the dungeon, so dig around and find it. This is a joke. This is not an adventure, this is not engaging gameplay, this is a waste of time. This isn't just a waste of my time, this is a waste of your time since I even have to include it in the video. I mean seriously, if you looked up padding in the dictionary, this would not show up. The next story, however. The dragons at the end of the game are just silly. I'm gonna list what you need to do, and feel free to stop me if any of this sounds even remotely interesting. Go find 50 music notes the size of goldfish in the first area, which is now underwater, sneak around the second area but without your stuff this time, and escort the slowest time shift stone known to man to a dragon who needs fruit. There's a special seed for the tree that grows the fruit, but it won't grow in Lanayru. So go back to Farron Woods, grow it there, give him the fruit, and finally get the last part of the song needed to access the final dungeon. The only thing here that didn't put me to sleep was probably the volcano section. It's actually a pretty neat idea that doesn't overstay its welcome. And honestly, I don't think the other two are terrible. I enjoyed the flooded forest for the first few minutes, but it just lasts way too long. The Lanayru quest should have ended after delivering the stone, but no, you have to go grow a tree. It's just unneeded padding. So that's it. That's a Zelda game. A story-heavy, character-focused, linear cinematic adventure. Now hold on. Did you really think that was it? This isn't a Zelda game. It's too linear. It's too story-heavy. There's only one town. That's no adventure. This can't be a Zelda game. But Ocarina of Time just might be. So Ocarina of Time needs no introduction. I mean, it's one of the most iconic video games of all time. And it's also the progenitor of the 3D Zelda formula. What makes this game so special, however, is its sense of adventure. What is an adventure, anyway? It's a word I've said 12 times in this video already, but I've yet to explain exactly what I define as an adventure. So let's do that. Ocarina of Time. That's it. That's an adventure. This game is the dictionary definition of an adventure. 1 minute Link is a lazy outcast kid sleeping at home, the next he's fighting a literal dinosaur in a volcano to save rock people from starving. And that's just the prologue. By the time Link gets the Master Sword, he's transported to a sacred realm called the Chamber of Sages. The kid got out of bed an hour ago and now he has a legendary sword in the world on his shoulders. In his quest, Link goes from town to town helping people, defeating monsters, and getting stronger. This idea of leaving home, exploring new places, and helping people is what makes this game an adventure. Through his quest, Link actively changes the world for the better. You can actually see the world becoming a better place as you traverse it. Of course, being a Zelda game, this world also has dungeons in it, and they're some of the best in the series. Let's start with Dodongo's Cavern. Link, who at this point is still a kid, meets Darunia in Goron City. The Gorons are starving because Ganon blocked off their food cave, so it's up to Link to go punch a dinosaur. Cool. Dodongo's Cavern is a pretty cool dungeon. It does this thing that a lot of dungeons in this game do. It introduces a concept, then escalates the complexity until eventually giving you an item that pushes the idea to its limits. I think the bomb flowers are the best example of this. The bomb flowers are an item on the ground that you can pick up and throw. They're bombs. It's pretty simple. But the catch is they're on a fuse and they're only in certain places, so you can only really use them in the area that they're in. Here's why this is an expert decision. By the time you get the bomb bag, an item that allows you to use bombs anywhere, you know exactly how bombs work, since you've been using a lesser version of this item throughout the whole dungeon. If they just gave you the bomb bag right off the bat, you would have to try to learn how bombs work, while also learning their applications through the dungeon, which granted wouldn't be impossible, but it would be a bit of a rough way to learn the mechanic. So by the end, you don't have to worry about throwing a bomb at a boss right before it shoots fire at you, because you've learned exactly how bombs work. It's a very simple concept, but the game does it multiple times and it's always done so well. So naturally, the puzzles follow this trend of escalating design. My favorite example of this escalating puzzle design is in the Shadow Temple. You get the Lens of Truth before this dungeon. The Lens of Truth allows you to see fake walls and invisible things. First, you use it to find the fake walls and progress, but as the dungeon progresses, you eventually use it for platforming and even enemies. So this progression goes from safe environment, where neither mistakes nor timing matter, to platforming, where mistakes matter but timing doesn't, and finally, to enemies and the boss, where you need to use everything you've learned so far about the Lens of Truth to succeed. The gradual scaling is how this game gets away with things like making you fight an invisible boss. Another thing I love about the dungeons in this game are that the items aren't throwaway items. All of them are used outside of the main dungeon they're introduced in. Take the Fire Temple, for example. The main item of this dungeon is the hammer, but this dungeon is still in the Elden Volcano, the same places you got the bombs, so the bombs are used here as well. You have to use the hover boots in the Spirit Temple, the hookshot in the Shadow Temple, and the bow pretty much everywhere. There's one last thing I want to talk about. It's outside of the gameplay of the dungeons, and more about the dungeons themselves, the set pieces. I absolutely love the idea that there are these massive structures filled with puzzles, monsters, and ancient mechanisms, all just below the surface. It's such a cool idea, and this game executes it incredibly well. All in all, this is my favorite set of Zelda dungeons. They're all the perfect length and difficulty. Even the infamous Water Temple wasn't that bad for me. I was able to finish it in a little over an hour. And I honestly can't even say I hated it. It was a cool dungeon that was almost like a huge Rubik's Cube. You had to consider how the water level would affect the whole dungeon every time you changed it. And I thought that was really cool. That said, my favorite dungeon is still Ganon's Castle. The length of this dungeon was perfect, and it combines all the ideas that you've learned from all the previous dungeons into one. It takes the hardest versions of all the puzzles from previous dungeons and puts them in small 1 or 2 room segments. It's the perfect way to end the game. But that's just half the story, right? What's a dungeon without a boss at the end? I love the bosses in this game. They're not as good as the dungeons, but I do still think most of them are pretty solid. I mentioned King Dodongo earlier, so let's talk about him first. King Dodongo is this huge dinosaur, maybe 15 times the size of Link. I love this as a concept for a boss because it really does show off Link's courage. He's a child fighting a fire-breathing dinosaur to help people he met 10 minutes ago. This is the work of a hero. But there's also the actual gameplay of this fight. It's a good fight, nothing incredible, but it's not bad. You use the bombs to stun him, and then you go up and hit him. That's it. Sure, nothing revolutionary, but you use the bombs to defeat an enemy by throwing them only when the enemy is vulnerable. This is a concept that has yet to be used in the dungeon. You go from bombing walls, to stationary enemies that are always weak to bombs, to moving enemies that are always weak to bombs, to finally a moving enemy that can only be damaged at certain moments. It's almost like he's the last puzzle of the dungeon in a way. Also, he's a fire-breathing dinosaur. Let's look at another one. Phantom Ganon is great, from a gameplay and presentation perspective. You walk into a room and see the King of Evil himself. Initially, you might think this is actually Ganon, but the Phantom removes his mask and the fight begins. It's a cool bait and switch, and he's a genuinely creepy and threatening looking enemy. As I mentioned, the gameplay of this fight is also great. Earlier in this dungeon, you were introduced to the idea that you can shoot enemies, specifically the Poes, with the bow while they're in paintings. So naturally, where does Phantom Ganon retreat to? The painting. But it's not just one, there are 6 in this room. So now it's not just about shooting a single painting, it's about finding the painting he's in and timing it correctly to damage him. It's a cool first phase of the fight, but once it's over, he hops off his horse and gives you a demo of the final boss. This doesn't use anything you've learned in a dungeon, it's just a test of your swordsmanship and reaction time. However, it's also to prepare you for your eventual showdown with the real thing. The last thing is linearity. Remember this? Do something on the sky, specifically in Skyloft, go down to the surface, complete a dungeon, go back to the sky, repeat. It's simple enough, but remember, that's all it is. Keep this in mind, it'll be important later. Yeah, when I said that, this is what I was talking about. Ocarina of Time has multiple towns, and it's honestly really fun going from town to town solving their problems and helping people. It feels more like a journey when you get to explore and figure things out. I will admit, however, there were a few times where I was a bit confused on where to go next, or what to do. But most of the time, the NPCs will give you small clues and hints on where to go. I'm not here to say this is an objectively better system than linearity, but it's certainly a change of pace. So, dungeons and bosses are great, game is less linear, and it feels like a true adventure. Perfect. Well, there's some negatives. The whole game is just generally kinda clunky. It occasionally asks you to do some platforming, like in the Shadow Temple with these guillotines, and this narrow bridge in the Fire Temple. I think the reason I don't like these sections is because of the auto jump. If I'm expected to do something like precise platforming, I feel like I should be able to control my character. The real issue with these sections, however, is that oftentimes when you fall, it sends you either back to the beginning of the room, or worse, earlier in the dungeon. It's not a big deal, it can just be a bit annoying sometimes. Combat is pretty slow. Actually, the combat won't let you express yourself at all. You can only really do what the game lets you do. Look at the Stalfos, for example. Navi literally tells you to wait for an opener. I'm the hero of time. I have the strongest sword in the universe. I'm destined to save the world, and you're telling me I have to just wait for this enemy to drop their guard? And sadly, this isn't the only example. Most enemies in this game require you to block while you simply wait for them to do something. Let's look at a few examples with funny music in the background to distract you from the fact that I'm terrified of criticizing this game. Now again, is this a huge deal? No, of course not. But I hope that montage showed you just how much waiting there is in this game's combat. It's not a problem once or twice, but when it's nearly every enemy in the game, it gets a bit tiring. I found myself avoiding combat just because I didn't want to have to stand around and wait to attack. The other issue with this game is a bit of a product of its time. It's small. I mean, there's certainly more to explore than Skyward Sword. There's more than one town. But the space between towns is totally empty. There's an adventure to be had, for sure. But what's an adventure without exploration? If only there was a Zelda game with a focus on exploration. That would be a real Zelda game for sure. Breath of the Wild is about exploration. That is its single strongest aspect by far. I firmly believe the exploration in Breath of the Wild is outdone only by maybe one other video game. Maybe. Most Zelda games claim to take you on an adventure, and they do, really. But that adventure is ultimately determined by the game. In Breath of the Wild, you, the player, determine the direction, pace, and flow of the adventure. So let's look at how the game accomplishes such a feat. The most important part of this game is the Great Plateau. This short section that lasts maybe 5 hours total is so critically important to teaching the player how to play the game. You have to remember, we're treading new grounds here for the Zelda series. Returning Zelda fans don't know how to play this game, and neither do new fans. If they mess this part up, the rest of the game will be a clunky mess, while the player desperately attempts to learn the mechanics. Fortunately, they didn't mess it up. In fact, they went above and beyond and made the best tutorial I've ever seen in a video game. So that's quite the statement to make. The greatest tutorial ever made. I said that because, well, it is. The game starts with Link waking up and walking out of the Shrine of Resurrection to see this. This never gets old. Let's talk about why this shot is so good. It's one thing to be told you can go anywhere and do anything, but this game does such a brilliant job of showing you the exact magnitude of that statement. Everything the light touches is yours. All of it. The massive, varied, beautiful world is yours to explore. No restrictions. This shot establishes purpose. It asks the player where they want to go, what they think lies just beyond that ridge, or what's on the top of that mountain. With just this one shot alone, you're already getting ideas of where you want to go and what you want to explore. That's extremely important in a game all about exploration. And it's not just the opening shot. The exceptional part of this tutorial is the actual gameplay. While on the Great Plateau, you learn about weapon durability, combat, puzzles, physics, fall damage, cold weather, environmental hazards, enemy camps, locked chests in those enemy camps, explosives, fire, cooking, food effects, cutting down trees, shrines, spirit orbs, stamina, and finally how to upgrade your health and stamina. And to top it off, the game stops to tell you something a grand total of twice. The fact that this game is designed so well that it can teach you this much without having someone stop to explain to you how certain effects work is absolutely masterful. This is how you make a good tutorial. This is how you teach something. You learn 98% of this game's mechanics by experimenting and figuring it out yourself, not by someone explaining it to you. After you get off the plateau, all that stuff you saw in the very first scene is now open to you. That's it. There are no other restrictions. You really can go anywhere with the right materials. Well, that's not totally true. You can't go to places like the very top of Death Mountain because the Divine Beast is in the way. However, you can go to Goron City and help them defeat the Divine Beast. You can do all of this before even seeing Kakariko. You can even beat all the Divine Beasts before Kakariko. In fact, you can beat the entire game. But everyone knows that, right? I don't think that's the impressive part of Breath of the Wild. Sure, you could beat the game in an hour, but outside of speedrunning, why would you? No, I think what matters is the fact that you can go anywhere. The adventure is determined by you. I remember watching a video about Ocarina of Time a few years ago where they mentioned that you can't go to Death Mountain until you're given a story reason to go. That's silly. I'm an adventurer. I want to go to Death Mountain because it's Death Mountain. In Breath of the Wild, you can. In Breath of the Wild, you can just decide what you want to do, where you want to go. Don't like the Divine Beasts? Don't do them. Don't want to be bothered by cutscenes and story? Don't have to be. If all you want to do is roam around the world, take pictures, and just enjoy the atmosphere, you can. That is the magic of Breath of the Wild. That is what it means to go anywhere and do anything. So let's talk about the loops, specifically gameplay loops. A huge reason why Breath of the Wild's open world stands as one of the greatest open worlds of all time is because everything is connected. Take weapon durability, for example. With this mechanic, the game can reward you with much stronger weapons than what you should have at the time as a reward for beating an enemy you weren't really supposed to. However, combat doesn't completely break because the weapon does first. If the Royal Claymore never broke, I'd have this crazy weapon for most of the game, and the combat would become entirely trivial. And that seems bad, sure, but it doesn't stop there. With a weapon that strong, I have no reason to get more weapons, I have no reason to try other weapons, I have no reason to raid camps or increase my defense because I can kill everything in one hit. I don't need to collect Korok seeds to increase my inventory because I only need one weapon. And the entire game is like this. Every mechanic is intertwined so well with everything else. Let's remove another mechanic. What if stamina didn't exist? Well, now that you can infinitely climb, there's no reason to search for a path up to the summit. You simply slow down, grab the wall, and climb all the way up. You'd max out on hearts pretty quickly if you didn't need to upgrade your stamina, so now half the shrines in the game are pointless. You can ignore things like grasshoppers, frogs, and other woodland creatures because you don't need stamina potions. You could swim forever, so Cryonis becomes almost entirely useless. You get the point. Now granted, these systems aren't perfect. Weapons can break a bit too fast sometimes, and I certainly wouldn't be upset if they removed that mechanic from the next game in favor of something better. However, the key there is in favor of something better. I don't want Nintendo to remove weapon durability and replace it with one sword for the entire game, unless it's a Sekiro sword. That'd be pretty cool. Anyway, now is the weapon breaking system perfect? No, not by any means. But is it bad? I don't think so. But enough talking about removing mechanics. Let's actually talk about how all these mechanics work together to create one of the best open worlds I've ever played. As I mentioned previously, Breath of the Wild's mechanics all work together super well. Korok seeds, for example, are essential for a multitude of reasons. First, they allow you to upgrade your inventory. This alone is a huge reason to search for them. And with this reason to search for them, you now have a reason to scan and scrutinize every blade of grass in this beautiful world to find as many as you can. The shrines are the same way. They give you short, simple puzzles, and the reward for them is a spirit ore, used to upgrade your health and stamina. Upgrading your stamina is also helpful as it allows you to climb higher and run for longer stretches of time. This means it's now easier to explore the world because you explored the world. This is absolutely brilliant. What better way to reward the player than making what they just did easier and more fun? Another example of this are the bugs and the small critters that you can find around the world. They may at first seem like small things to enhance the atmosphere, but no, you can actually catch all of them. With them, you can make elixirs and special foods that, you guessed it, make exploring the world easier and more fun. If you catch certain types of bugs, you can make elixirs that make you resistant to heat and cold. Now you can travel without worrying about heat stroke, hypothermia, or other minor inconveniences. Enemy camps are important too. You can beat enemies in these camps to get monster parts, weapons, and gemstones. You can sell the monster parts and gemstones for rupees you can use to get armor and unlock fairy fountains. Fairy fountains upgrade your armor pieces in their special abilities, like the climbing set, which once upgraded reduces stamina consumption by 50% when climbing. This is why Breath of the Wild is such a fun game to play. In most open world games, traveling from place to place is simply traveling. In Breath of the Wild, traveling is part of the gameplay. So you know how this goes by now. I talk about what makes a game sick, then I dunk on it because no game is perfect. Well, this is different. This game is perfect. I refuse to critique it. I don't want to, and you can't make me. Fine. The insides of the dungeons are all a bit too aesthetically similar, and while the actual puzzles of the dungeons are great, they're all pretty short. And more than anything, I do wish we had classic dungeons like Ocarina of Time. Imagine going into a forest and just stumbling across the forest temple, or maybe seeing some bubbles in a lake and going over to see the water temple. The other issue with Breath of the Wild is it doesn't have much of a story. You know, it would be nice if there was a Zelda game that had more of a story-first approach. Skyward Sword is a divisive game, to say the least. Let me get this right out of the way. I love this game. The story of Skyward... Look, truth is, there is no Zelda game. It doesn't exist. There is no magic formula that all Zelda games must follow. The idea that all Zelda games must be like the first one because that's the most pure Zelda game is absurd. The idea that all Zelda games must be like Ocarina of Time because that's the most iconic Zelda game is equally absurd. The idea that all Zelda games should be like Breath of the Wild is absolutely true. Okay, fine, that's dumb too, I guess. While these games are all similar, they're very, very different. On a fundamental level, all Zelda games are as follows. Link wakes up, clears some dungeons, gets a stronger sword, kills Demise Ganon or Vati, and sometimes saves the princess. But the games are so much more than that. Each game is different and brings its own specialties to the table. Distilling a Zelda game down to a simple formula and limiting it to a structure that must be followed is doing a disservice to the works of art that these games can be. Compare any two Zelda games and you'll instantly find that they both do things better than the other. By restricting these games to a set formula, you're removing what truly makes it a Zelda game. You're removing the adventure. That's the true Zelda formula. Whether skyward bound or drifting time or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight, you're going on an adventure. And that's what makes a Zelda game. A Zelda game is the puzzle design and otherworldly ideas of Link's Awakening. A Zelda game is the atmosphere of Majora's Mask. A Zelda game is the story of Skyward Sword. A Zelda game is the exploration of Breath of the Wild. A Zelda game is an adventure. Alright, I've recorded this outro like 5 times already. Whatever we get this take, we're just gonna roll with it. So that's the video. Really hope you liked it. I enjoyed making it quite a lot, and I'll be making more content like this in the future, probably a big video like this once a month, and stream highlights throughout the month. Speaking of stream, you can go ahead and check out twitch.tv/mhswooser if you want to see any of the streams. I'd really appreciate it if you stopped by, and that's about all I've got. So, yeah, hope you have a good one. See you guys around.